Having a Cat N sticker labelled on a car when you see an advert on Auto Trader, for example, does often make you kind of steer clear, and for good reason. Cat N cars are ones that have been written off by insurance companies as not structurally damaged, but damaged enough that they can't afford to repair it. So why should you buy one of these? My friend bought one. This is a Cat N 530D. We're going to do a few videos on this, but the first one is, should you buy one? And I guess a bit of advice on how to go about buying one if you're really determined. So the first thing you have to know about Cat N vehicles is what Cat N actually means. That is the UK government's standard for a vehicle that has been written off by an insurance company but has non-structural damage. If it's a Cat S car, then that means that it has structural damage, and that's generally one that, unless you're very handy with a welder, you probably want to steer clear of. With Cat N, that generally means things like bodywork or wheels, even potentially suspension components, rather than crash structures, the body shell, all that sort of stuff. So why would you want to buy a Cat N car like this? Well, the really only pro that you have to this is the value proposition. You can buy Cat N vehicles for significantly cheaper than a standard non-categoried vehicle. The benefit of that is, of course, you get more for your money. You can often get significantly lower mileage cars than you would for the same kind of money, or you can even get higher spec versions, like you could buy a 530D instead of a 520, for example. But the reasons you might want to avoid getting one, well, they're pretty plentiful. Depending on how the accident damage happened, if it's been repaired, how it's been repaired, is the difference between it being an astonishing deal and a massive hazard. For example, if it's had a rear end impact, it could just be some bodywork damage that needs to be repainted or repaired, but it could also be crash structure damage. It could be wiring looms that have been pinched or, shorted, damaged in some way that need replacing, and a whole lot else that can mean the difference between, like I said, it being a fairly simple fix and being an incredibly costly, if not hazardous one. The other thing to remember is that when you buy a Cat N car, you're not getting a seamless experience like you will if you buy a standard one, especially if you're buying one from a dealership. You will have to repair this, either by taking it to mechanics who are willing to work on it or by doing it yourself, and so you will need to be relatively handy in working on cars if you're going to be willing to take on that project. You definitely have to accept the risks that you're taking by getting a Cat N car, and definitely there are some. But if you are, let's face it, foolish enough to take on that endeavor, then here are some bits of advice, things to look out for, things to check if you are going to go down that route. So as with most car buying purchases, you tend to have a look at ads online first, whether that's Auto Trader or Copart or even just someone selling it on Facebook Marketplace. Now, depending on what sort of damage the car has, it's going to be more or less visible in those pictures. For this car, the damage that it actually has is a reasonable sized crack along the rear bumper on the sort of edge, but that didn't show up overly well in pictures. So do bear in mind that pictures may be a little bit deceptive, but oftentimes you'll see the damage pretty obviously. It'll be bumpers, it'll be damage to the doors, or something relatively obvious that will make you go, ah yes, that's the problem. The important thing to note, like I said earlier, is that even if you see visible damage, there could be significantly more damage, especially elsewhere in the car. Especially modern cars like this, they're pretty much all electronic systems, and so you will need to make sure that when you go and inspect the car, you do bring ideally dealership level diagnostics like ISTA for BMWs, VIDAR for Volvos, or even something like VCDS for Audis. When you do go to inspect the car, honestly, the first thing you'll probably want to do is speak to the owner. If you're buying it from a breaker's yard, especially if you're buying it from someone like Copart, then obviously you can't do that overly much. But if you're buying it from a private seller, then definitely speak to the owner. Speak to them and ask them if they were the one who damaged the car, if they were in the accident. If they were, great, because you can ask exact questions about what happened. You can ask about if it's been repaired at all. Whereas if you're buying it from someone who bought it from someone else, then you have a bit more of a chain. Either way, you should definitely ask how the damage was done, what repairs have been made, and see if there is anything obvious about what will need repairing, and maybe if there's something a little less obvious. If when talking to the current owner, the deal seems a bit too good to be true, it probably is, or even if you're just not quite sure that they're telling, I guess, the whole truth, then that could be a very good sign for you to steer clear. If you talk to the current owner and you're fairly happy with the history of the car, then you will need to inspect it a lot more thoroughly than you would a standard car purchase. So what you want to do is inspect the area that the damage has happened. That's probably the obvious one. But you also want to assess the area around it. So if, for example, it's had rear bumper damage, you want to check under the rear bumper to see the rear crash structure. Even if you're not taking it off, just have a look under the car, especially for front and rear bumpers. Those crash structures can be very expensive and very crucial to have intact. Otherwise, you might also want to do things like jacking up the car and taking a few wheels off to check that associated suspension components, especially right next to the damage area, make sure that the suspension arms aren't bent, the shock absorbers and springs are fine, all the mounts and bushings are where they should be. That can be a necessity or a very useful thing to have. Also, like any modern car, like I said, they're all pretty much just electronic systems, and so you will definitely need to check and make sure that all of the electronic systems actually work. For example, in this car, the rear parking sensors, and actually all sets of parking sensors, don't work. That's something that will need to be repaired at some point. On iDrive, it shows up as there's no parking sensor faults, but the sensors don't actually work, they don't display anything. So things like that, things like iDrive or your infotainment systems, things like accessories, things like windows, lights, all of that sort of stuff you need to make sure works before you make a purchase, because trust me, that stuff is expensive. If the car has had front end damage, there's quite a lot more to check. You want to check that things like the radiators, the AC condenser, all of the other ancillaries that are hanging off the front of the car, they're all intact. Check things like the coolant temperature, get the car up to temperature and see how quickly it gets there, if it stays at temperature or if it goes a bit above, or all that sort of stuff to make sure that the engine and cooling systems, AC, if that blows cold, make sure all of that sort of stuff works. If it's had either end of a relatively serious impact but not structural, check things like when you go for a test drive, make sure that the transmission shifts into every gear, make sure that there's no noises or vibrations from the driveline, from the U-joints in the drive shaft, for example, being broken, or those sorts of things. No rattles where there shouldn't be, all the engine mounts are all good, all that sort of stuff. But if all of that seems fine, then still proceed with caution, check all of the electronics, check the fault codes, check everything you can. But again, if all of that seems to point to it being a good car, then you might have actually found a good, a bargain, a good value, and it might be worth proceeding. Again, still with caution. So that's pretty much an explanation of Cat-N cars, why you might want one or not, and a bit about how to go about getting one if you're really dead set on the idea. If you want to see more videos like this one on a weekly basis, then hit that subscribe button with the bell notification icon, and feel free to check out some more videos over there as well to keep watching. There's plenty for you to choose from, including a load of stuff on my car, my 2013 Audi S4, and a load of other stuff, so feel free to check it out. Also, feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. What do you think about Cat-N cars? And if you're interested in seeing a video on this car specifically, again, hit that subscribe button. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next video. To it being an absolute dumpster fire. Oh, they're literally mating.